All right. We're good. We're live, Alexander.
Mm.
So, first of all, how are you doing this
Well,
evening?
tired, obviously, but it's been an engrossing time, obviously, and we got much going on, and I'm fine. I'm well.
Yeah. All right. So, a couple of things to
Mm.
everybody that's watching. Welcome. If you're
Mm.
on watching us on Odyssey, on Locals, our great Locals community, and on Rumble as well as YouTube. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to all our moderators.
Mhm.
I see Valley S is in the house, and Cosmic Rains, Ariel, well, Lady Cosmica, not Cosmic Rain anymore, Lady Cosmica, and Reckless Abandon. And I think I saw Alan Watson in here. So thank you to all our moderators as well. And real quick to everybody that's watching us on YouTube, YouTube has announced that they will begin removing videos, not channels, videos of that go against the Western narrative with regards to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. They said they're going to also block state media channels.
Mm.
I think they've already done that, so I don't
I
quite
don't quite
understand that.
understand it. No, no.
But they definitely said that they're going to remove video. So
Yeah,
anybody that's watching us on YouTube, please make sure you plug into us on Rumble,
yeah,
on Odyssey, on BitChute, on SuperU. Though we can only go live on Rumble and Odyssey, are the only two that have a live streaming feature. And absolutely, positively, the Duran.locals.com. The Duran.locals.com. That is where we have an amazing community, and that is where all our content is going up. So find us on those sources because, as we were saying before we went live, Alexander, a lot of the censorship is going to come down really hard. You're going to start to see more sanctions. They're going to try to put more sanctions. I mean, they're announcing different things, but you know better than I do. These things seem kind of meaningless what they're announcing, given that they've already thrown the nuclear bomb of sanctions on Russia with regards to the central bank. But they're going crazy. They are going crazy, and we're seeing mass hysteria, mass bigotry and hate towards Russians as well. And we're seeing this because, as we were talking before, I clicked that live button. Alexander, this is all because it's becoming very clear that, at least the way we're seeing things, Russia is clearly winning in, especially in the east, Mariupol, the Donbass, and the cauldrons are heating up, and these encirclements they're tightening. So you're going to see, I think in the next 2-3 days, 4 days, I think you're going to see absolute positive hysteria like we've never seen before. And one final announcement, Alexander, and you can start to talk about everything I've said as well. Before we went live, right before we went live again, I said, expect some sort of chemical or bio false flag. I say that because we have statements just today, literally a couple of hours ago, where U.S. President Biden said that a NATO-Russia conflict would be World War III. And a reporter asked the question about a chemical attack. And of course, Biden said the Kremlin would pay a severe price. The narrative is there. It's been spun. It's been created with the Newland testimony, with the Rubio questioning, with this reporter giving Biden what I believe to be, in my opinion, what was a planted question. And it is following the exact same script as Syria and Assad. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm seeing the playbook, the game plan unfold in the same exact way it would unfold with it did unfold with Syria and Assad. And the fact that this reporter gave Biden that question, and let me read it to you, Alexander, and then you can follow up. This is from C-SPAN. The question: would the U.S. have a military response if Putin does launch a chemical weapons attack? President Biden's answer, and I quote, Russia would pay a severe price if they use chemical weapons. And from Jen Psaki, now that Russia has made these false claims and China has seemingly endorsed this propaganda, we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine, or to create a false flag operation using them. It's a clear pattern. That's a direct quote from a tweet that Jen Psaki put out there, Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I don't see any logic, let me say this straight away, in the Russians using chemical weapons in Ukraine. And so far, I have to say, nobody has suggested on the Russian side that I'm aware of that they will be using chemical weapons. So, I mean, the very fact that we're talking about this, and I think I see the great Robert Barnes joining us. So, hello, Robert, and good to see you. And it's always a joy to have you joining us on these programs.
I was trying to find my Putin photo to put behind me, and get a little Russian cap on to troll all the everybody out there. But but yeah, I'm glad to be here. It's been man, you're definitely right. The old Lenin quote. Sometimes decades happen in a few years.
Yeah.
We have lived through some interesting times, and this is no less of one.
Absolutely so. Yeah.
So before both of you get rolling, and we were just talking, Robert, about the statements from Biden, the fact that there were questions thrown at him about a chemical attack, and Jen Psaki said there's going to be a chemical attack, it's coming, and blame Russia. We talked about YouTube censorship that was announced today, and how things are just ramping up. And before we get rolling, I just want to say two things, two questions to you. Where can people find you?
Oh, at like with you guys at Duran.locals.com. You can find me at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, where there's been a lot of great, robust discussion and conversation and great links about a bunch of things. And I just saw a brief link about the UN playing the old game of biosafety labs versus biological weapons. It's the Orwellian language is just something to witness.
Yeah. And before you continue, Alexander, to what you were saying, and I'm so excited to listen to you, Robert, because I just want to say one thing. I saw your hush hush that you gave, I believe, 3-4 days ago, where you went into pretty much the whole history of what's going on. And I just want to say that was epic. That was a tour de force. I'm going to find that link, and I'm going to put it in the description box down below after we finish this live stream, because I encourage everybody to see that hush hush that Robert gave to his locals community. I believe it's only locals that you give those, correct?
Oh yeah. It's only the locals community. It's the alternative historical take to various events that may either have occurred, are occurring, or will occur. And the first ever hush hush was just that January 6th might not have been what people cracked it up to be, and of course that evidence has just accumulated. So it's a lot of fun.
So that was just a great episode, and I will put that link after this live stream. I'll find that link and I'll put it down below. Alexander, Robert, the floor is yours. Alexander, you were talking about the statements from President Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I think that nobody. I mean, if the Kremlin were to start using chemical weapons in Ukraine, they would have taken leave of their senses, because they have no reason to. The situation in eastern Ukraine is starting to go decisively their way. Now, I am not the only person saying this, and I think this is when we talk, I say not the only person. We are not the only people saying this. There was, as I pointed out yesterday to Alex. And as we've published on our locals platform, there was the first admission in the London Times that what the Russians call a cauldron, an encirclement of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine is developing. Now, it may have developed further than the London Times was prepared to admit to, but it's the first occasion that I've seen what I'm going to continue calling a mainstream media outlet in the Western world admitting that this development is underway in eastern Ukraine. And that's perhaps something that's going to be very, very difficult to explain, given all that we've been hearing coming out of both the media, of the governments, about how, Ukraine is winning the war. It's not winning the war at all. It's losing the war. I mean, that shouldn't really be a surprise, given the enormous discrepancy in power. But the London Times seems to be preparing its readers for the fact that, as I said, there's going to be big events coming shortly. And another event that happened today was that we've learned again, this is the Russians who are saying this, but I haven't seen any denials from Ukraine, that an important town called, I think, Volkhov, but I'm not going to try and get the name right, but a town in East Volnokova has now apparently been captured by the Russians and the militias of the Donbass, which closes this trap a bit further. It was a major logistical base. That's all I wanted to say about this. The other thing I wanted to start with, though, was that we've had a big summit meeting in Versailles in France of the great and the good of the EU. And the thing that absolutely took my breath away was that there was a comment there by Josep Borrell, who is the EU's external affairs high representative. In other words, the EU's so-called quasi foreign minister, except of course that he isn't a foreign minister. And he's now saying, I mean, I actually read him to say that offering Ukraine NATO membership was a mistake. I mean, if he'd said this 4 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago, a month ago, we wouldn't be in this situation. I mean, I have to say, calling this a mistake at a moment like this, I mean, it just astonished me. Anyway, they didn't come up with some of the sanctions that people expected. They haven't stopped imports of oil or gas. They've come up with a plan to wean themselves off those imports. Nobody believes it. There was a furious article in the Daily Telegraph denouncing them for coming up with a plan that nobody believes in. And the result is that they didn't come up with those sanctions. But I suspect the pressure to reverse that is going to mount over the next few days, especially, as I said, if there's a clear defeat of the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine. And I think we've got to be prepared now for a very, very rough ride.
Yeah. Robert, how are you seeing things in all of this? Mute. Unmute. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, great. It's been extraordinary watching all the coverage in the sense of this is, I think, the first sort of global social media war to a certain degree. I mean, that social media was around for Libya and part of Iraq and Afghanistan for sure. But in terms of initial entry, I mean, it's been tuned, and social media was really designed for war propaganda. I mean, social media has so much algorithmic manipulation designed to create addiction and emotional patterns. And it's been a little frightening. I mean, the scale and speed success they've had with certain constituencies. I mean, you have social media saying, okay, inciting violence is bad unless it's against Russians. Then it's okay. Then it's like against just Russians generally. I mean, can we just limit it to at least military or whatever? Nope. No. If you want to go out and whack some Russians, go ahead and talk about it. All all that's ready to go. Not to mention kids getting kicked out of things, people losing their jobs around the world just because they're Russian. Calls for people of mass expulsions from colleges and universities, deportations in some instances. A friend of mine who is Irish had to escape Russia with a Russian boyfriend, and it's trying to figure out how to deal with all this because of the insanity that's taking place in the West. So that's been a little unsettling to witness it in live time and to see how it progresses. But in the same vein, the degree of just overt as to just taking one aspect, the military aspect that you guys have talked about extensively, that the unwillingness to accept that their interpretations of the Russian conflict or Russian-Ukrainian war were wrong is they're just not, they can't accept it. Instead, they have to spin ridiculous narratives about what's happening militarily in order to justify their underlying beliefs about what is happening in the conflict and, most importantly, the purpose of it. Because if Putin is going in and Russia is going in to take over Ukraine and use it as a staging ground to later go into other parts of Western Europe, then you do use a shock and awe type campaign. You do secure all the borders. You definitely secure the Polish border. You don't allow weapons to just continue to flood across that border. You do like what the U.S. has done in every war since World War II, which is you bomb the living hell out of everybody and everything. People have highlighted the fact that the U.S. military lost 10 times fewer people than the Russian military has at this stage in Iraq. The flip side of that is we also had killed 10 times more civilians than the Russians have at this time in Iraq, and that's using the UN's own data. And it's because they can't, in order to say that there never was a shock and awe campaign, that this isn't the Russian military strategy, was to concede that the political objective wasn't the one that they said it was. I mean, those of us who didn't think Putin would go in or Russia would go in was because their narrative was he was going in for the purpose of conquest, for the purpose of dominating Ukraine, for the purpose of rebuilding the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. That was never true, and it's still not true. And the way he's gone in militarily proves that even further. He's going out of his way to avoid civilian casualties, even at the expense of Russian soldiers. I mean, you could save a lot of Russian lives if you just didn't try to go in and do almost, I think the way you described it, Alexander, is almost a quasi-police action using military is accurate. Now, that increases the risk to Russian lives. It's also going to make things go a little slower, but that conforms to what they want in order to make diplomacy effective. I mean, if you do like the EU and the West did, and you just do all your ammunition in the economic war at once, you don't have any place to go. There's no place to escalate. You've forfeited your diplomatic tools.
Exactly.
Your leverage has disappeared. Whereas if you go in slow and say, well, we'll go a little bit further unless you settle, and we'll go a little further unless you settle. That military diplomatic correspondence, it just can't work within the West narrative of Putin. It's like the whole disaster of a lot of this relates to the utter absence of strategic empathy being taught and being used as a skill set within the West diplomatic corps and intelligence analytical corps. But of course, you can't use strategic empathy if to do so would undermine your demonization and caricaturing someone else. You can't hate Putin if you come to understand him. And so you can't use this critical tool, which means you can't understand your purported adversary, which means you can't predict what he does will do, and you can't explain what he has done. And that's what it seems to. It's a combination of this is really a globalist nationalist fight being fought on just between these two countries as a backdrop, but also it's due to the incredible ineptitude and incompetence of Western elites. And it reminds me of like right leading up to World War I. They always want to use the World War II script. Everything's compared to Hitler or Stalin. Nobody's comparing anything to all the other wars that were disasters or debacles over history. But it reminds me, going to World War I, the Ottoman elites, the British Empire elites, the Russian Empire elites, and the German Empire elites. You guys do that great history series. You go back and you dig into those things. They all screwed up. I mean, they managed to kill their empires in 5 seconds. Did we lose Alexander?
Yeah. He'll come back. He must have pressed the button.
So, I mean, you look at that, all of those, I mean, can you imagine killing empires that had been in some cases centuries old in about a decade? And that's what the British, the Russians, the Germans, and the Ottomans all managed to do within a single decade. And you go back and study a lot of the books and text for this. It's because their elites completely misread it. I mean, the worst misreading was by the British. I mean, they thought they were going to have the ultimate empire. They're going to bring back the U.S. as a colony, according to Dear Cecil Rhodes, all that kind of stuff. But I mean, instead, it's because they didn't even anticipate this possibility. And you see in the West, they can't even explain what's happening in Ukraine because it means refuting their underlying premises.
I think you put it absolutely brilliantly, Robert. I mean, we've been trying in program after program to explain on the Duran that things are not being done the way that people in the West do them, or at least they imagine, they project on the Russians that they would do them. I've read some very, very strange things. I read, for example, an article somewhere, I think it was on the Rusi forum, which is a sort of military forum connected to NATO, but the idea that that the reason that the Russians haven't bombed Ukraine to pieces is because their air force isn't up to doing it. They don't have a big enough air force. I mean, this is fantasy. The reason they're not doing it is because they have taken a decision not to do it. Now, they've taken that decision because they have a political objective, and they see that political objective that taking that kind of step would contradict achieving that political objective. But of course, we don't want to accept that there is a political objective that's different from the one that we think. And we just don't understand that. And the other thing I think, which is important to say, and it's a point that it's embedded in your points, is that the Russians are doing diplomacy and war at one and the same time. Now, that's not what we've done in the West, well, for as far back as I can remember. We don't simultaneously fight and negotiate with someone. We don't attack Iraq, invade Iraq, and negotiate with Saddam Hussein at the same time, or do the same in Afghanistan. We didn't attack Afghanistan and at the same time sit down and talk with the Taliban's representatives. That's not what we do. Now, because we don't do that, that doesn't mean that others might not do that. And of course, that's exactly what the Russians are doing, because for them, much more perhaps than for us, war is indeed an extension of politics. It's politics by other means. It's diplomacy by other means. So you move into Ukraine, you put enormous pressure on the Ukrainian government, you make demands of that government, which it would never have made in peacetime. You change the frame of the discussion, and that's your political objective. And when you have people like Josep Borrell coming along and saying, well, it was a mistake to offer NATO membership to Ukraine. Well, he would never have said that a month ago. So you could see how, or even in that small way, taking this kind of step has achieved already particular outcomes. And by the way, on the point of casualties, one of the important things always to understand about Russians, the Russian way of approaching things, is that they are prepared to accept losses in order to achieve their objectives, which we are not able to do. And that is a fundamental difference in our societies. So the Russians are prepared to take losses, and that affects the way they conduct war in order to achieve their objectives. Whereas for us in war, minimizing losses is the overriding imperative. And that's, again, not the Russian way.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And the other thing I think they made a mistake of was isolating Afghanistan and Chechnya and not recognizing those were deviations rather than the norm for a Russian military approach, and especially for Putin. I mean, like they didn't recognize what Putin learned from Chechnya, and he inherits it from Yeltsin. Initially goes in, and again, while they bombed Grozny, they didn't do it with air power. I mean, that's the other thing. Some of these dumb statements. Oh, they're not. They can do it from the ground. If they want to bomb it's like when these accusations. Oh, they're trying to landmine the humanitarian corridors to kill the civilians when they come out. They're trying to bomb children's hospitals. They're trying to set off nuclear. It's like, why? If their goal was to do that, they would just do that. There's nothing limiting their capacity to bomb the living dickens out of anything through the air or on the ground. I mean, they've proven that in the past. But I mean, what Putin, and then that's the problem with all these obvious false flag staged events. But when you throw in a corrupt grifter Ukrainian regime with some aspects of a Ukrainian military and the neo-Nazi aspects that this may be a do or die occasion for, and people forget, I mean, the Azov battalion recruited from literally around the world. Are you a neo-Nazi? Come to Ukraine. I mean, they're advertising in Brazil, for crying out loud. So, I mean, where there might be some sons and grandsons of some prior escaped Nazis, thanks to the U.S. But if there's going to be false flag or staged events, it's going to come from Ukraine, and they've already tried 3 or 4 of them. I mean, the president Zelensky himself going out there, he's reading different scripts on different days. Apparently, reads different scripts for different interviews. That's why you get one script over here, and then the next polar opposite over here, and then over. It's because I guess he's got a different script for this one. Okay, here's my reading points. Probably one of the most pitiful presidents and political leaders in world history during a conflict, and it's so sad that Americans are celebrating him the lefty female thirst that's promoting him as the next Andrew Cuomo, and how did that work out? I remember all the Cuomo memes of, oh God, I just da, 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 da. Michael Avenatti before that. The View was like, oh my, da, 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 da. And now they're doing it after Zelensky, who I do think, and we can talk about this, also as whether or not he has a Batista style exit plan. They already got the homes and the condos and the reality TV and the movie deals lined up for him. And what you said the other day, in terms of there being potential, special units that may be ready to pull him out at a moment's notice. That I'll just say that's a reasonable inference, but not going any further detail. But it's been extraordinary that they complete. Increasingly, I'm coming to believe that it isn't just propaganda. A lot of this military spin, a lot of this interpretation by the media of Putin, but a lot of them really believe this inane and insane ideas. That like you go through some of the Twitter threads of these guys that work at the think tanks and their interaction with each other, just like the message boards you're talking about. They say some of the things that shock me in terms of how dumb they are. And it was like they really believed. There are people that have high-ranking think tank positions that are part of this whole campaign, part of the intellectual architecture, if you will, who are predicting that Russia would fold within 2 weeks because of how the economic sanctions would just crush them, and that they would have to leave with their head between their legs from Ukraine because of the regime change that would otherwise come. And it's like, where do these people live? It's like, that's not even close to accurate. As you point out, Alexander, the Russians are happy with misery to a certain degree. I mean, that's a tough mindset. They're not folding, capitulating, or overthrowing anybody anytime. And least of all, the man that many of them still think. Richard Barris and I just went through all the data on a Monday show, and what are the odds of, this is a man who's got 20 years of goodwill. He's got a lot of political capital with anybody over the age of 30 in Russia because of the dramatic reductions of crime, dramatic reductions of inflation, dramatic improvements in unemployment, dramatic improvement in wages, dramatic improvement in basic everyday lifestyle. In fact, frankly, the best the Russian working class arguably has ever had.
Absolutely.
So the idea they're going to turn on him overnight because they buy into some Western propaganda, or they can't access Facebook, or and then of course there's the economic misreading. It's like, just because you think, I saw all these, like your casual YouTube foreign policy experts, right? The ones with the YouTube channels that YouTube likes to promote, the legal eagles of the legal world, but in the foreign policy world. And all of them were just buying in hook, line, and sinker to Western analysis. The Russian economy is about to collapse. It's going to implode. Putin's going to be done. He's going to be finished. And without even recognizing basic things like, there's a big difference between the value of the ruble and its foreign exchange. And now, can you buy a Mercedes or a BMW easily in Russia? Now, can you go on vacation to Paris? Things that only the Russian elite are doing. Versus, is my food cost going up? Is my gas bill going up? Is my, as you've described, Alexander, are you getting a notice that says, 53% increase in your utility bill this week? Are those things going up? And in Russia, food and fuel, they control it. Those things are already priced in rubles. They don't have to import food and fuel like much of the rest of the world's going to find out when they get hit with the real economic effects of these sanctions. So ordinary Russians, like, I went back and looked at 2015, where inflation went up by about 15-16% after the first round of sanctions, but most of that inflation was in luxury goods. You looked at ordinary foodstuffs, it was within the same range it had been for the last 15 years. And he's maintained very good inflation rates, balanced budgets, good reserves, low external debt, all of those things. All of these conservatives say they like. That's why it's ironic to hear these conservatives who hate him. Like, Putin gogoverns Russia the way you guys say you would like a country to be governed. If he adds a gold-backed currency, I love how new level of heroism in certain parts of the world. But it was never going to happen that Russia was going to collapse like this, because he has built up as self-sufficient a country as you can get. And as you mentioned, Alexander, a mindset of Russian people more than willing to withstand a little bit of pain.
Well, I would just say this. I mean, I've just seen the latest opinion polls in Russia. Now, you can take them however cynically you wish, but I personally do believe them. And his popularity has grown. So his support has grown from 64% to 74%, and 78% think he's made the correct decisions. And apparently it's rising. So, I mean, it's exactly what you said. I think also, and this isn't, this is what I'm hearing from people who are there, including Western people who are there. There's still some, believe it or not. When this all started, when the fighting began 2 weeks ago, I mean, there was an immediate shock, but then after that, the mood stiffened. And a lot of people, most people, including people in the academic community, who are the people who, through my wife, I have contacts with, they accepted the rationale of why, that he gave for what he did. It's something that they agree with. Now, you can explain that in all kinds of different ways. But this idea that there's going to be an immediate turning against him is just, it's fantasy. It's not
been
happening.
justified, Alexander. I mean, it has the reasons he's given, Alexander Robert, in a way you could say have been justified because the West has shown their vitriol towards Russian people, not towards the government, Russian people. And then you have this whole, these biolab things and all these other things going on, and these other documents about the attack on the East. I'm not saying those documents are true or not, but he has presented a case. I mean, you guys are lawyers. He has presented a case.
The way I describe it is, if we were in a court of law, and I tend to impose that filter on a lot of things, and say the U.S. and the West was on one side, Putin and Russia was on the other, and it was totally neutral decision makers as the jury pool. Russia would have the better argument. Even though I have an instinctive opposition to war, I tell people it's a bias. It's not really rooted in reason, and because if you look through human history, most government societies and civilizations have achieved what they wanted through war more often than not. Now, I agree with Clausewitz that the fog of war, what he was referencing, was the fog of uncertainty, that you don't know what's going to happen when you go in, and things tend to go AWOL. And the best predictions easily go sideways, like we were mentioning earlier, where 4 great empires enter World War I thinking they're going to come out on top, and all of them are finished as empires by the end of it. And several of them finished for forever. I mean, the German 3 of the 4 gone, period. And so unleashing problematic things. I mean, you could say the seeds of communism, the seeds of fascism, and to some degree, even the seeds of Islamic fundamentalism are born out of World War I in part, in terms of aspects of the Arabist revolt against the Ottomans, connected to the Muslim Brotherhood that we help propagate, but that's another story. The research about the nice mosque in Munich, as a reporter did some years ago. It's why the Putin mentioned, still being ticked off, that he blames parts of the West for what happened in Chechnya, because some CIA spooks ended up in some places they weren't supposed to be. Before we had the brothers doing what they did in Boston, but the whole sort of dynamic of this approach that the Russian people would react negatively was never going to be accurate if you understood what was going to happen. But also just on the international stage, I've taken more the American position. It's where I disagree with my friends, Antiwar friends on the left and on the libertarian side. I haven't had a legal problem with a lot of American conflicts. I've had a policy problem with a lot of American conflicts. But I believe that extended self-defense should be robust. I don't have a problem with it. I have a problem with preventative war. Not because the probability that gets misread is too high and leads to too many conflicts. But I don't have a problem with the preemptive war, in part because it's practical. I mean, if the one point of the rule of law is to have rules that people are going to obey. If you have a rule of law that societies and civilizations would never obey, then you don't really have a rule of law, and it's useless, and it undermines the credibility of the rule of law itself. And in that capacity, I don't have a problem with preemptive war, in the sense that as an ordinary person, if I thought George across the street was planning to kill me and I had evidence that George was planning to kill me, I don't know if I have to wait for George to have the gun at my head before I defend myself. Just as a practical matter, and I think it's even more true for states. And I think, the U.S. clearly has taken that position. It's shocking to see people like Condoleezza Rice show up on Fox News, and the Fox News lady say, I always thought, it's like third grade interpretation. Somehow we always resort to these childish mindsets during war. I always thought that invading a sovereign nation was just a war crime by itself. And Condoleezza Rice saying, yes, that absolutely is true. Am I watching a parody? Is this like a Babylon Bee satire that I've accidentally lipped into? Because, it's like, what do you think Iraq was? What do you think Libya was? What do you think Syria was? Well, what do you think Afghanistan in part was? Afghanistan being a slightly different animal. But and then what North Korea was, I mean, or Korea itself, North Korea to this day lives off of how many civilians we killed in that Korean War. They
Yeah.
live off that institutional memory in order to maintain the basis of this super hyper defensive regime. And it's because we killed 1 out of 5 civilians in the North Korea during that war because we were brutal. We were vicious. And then you see these British reporters get on there and tell Lavrov he's going to be up on the War Crimes Tribunal. It's like, is she British? Does she remember what the Brits did in Africa and Asia and India? Well, a lot of those people still do. So it's just astounding to witness the degree of ignorance and incompetence and mythology and bad mythology, and but also just ideas. I mean, especially when you add, what were 60,000 troops doing next to the Donbass?
Yeah.
I mean, why are they there such that they could be trapped? I mean, clearly they were. And why did they have more than 2,000 violations, according to the OSCE, the weekend before in shelling the Donbass?
Yes.
I mean, they already made it a shell of a country, a shell of a region anyway, over the prior 8 years, 14,000 or so killed, mostly civilians, many of them children. British reporters didn't seem to care about those kids.
No.
And why were they there, number one? Number two, what exactly were they doing on the nuclear side? Well, what was going on? Clearly, the Russians think something was going on in terms of how aggressively they secured the Russian nuclear plants beyond maybe false flag staged events. And 3, obviously, we did have a bunch of biolabs. And for those people out there, you're going to hear a lot of stuff in the media, like you hear the UN today, that there's no biological weapons labs. This is because since the 1980s, when various treaties were passed, various U.S. domestic laws were passed, most biological weapons are illegal under U.S. law, domestically or internationally, for U.S. purposes, for a range of reasons. The way everybody gets around them is they say they're not, even though they're doing gain of function research, and this is level 4, which I always love. It's BS because biosafety. So it's like BS level 1, BS level 2, BS level 3. These guys are just, their names are amazing. But is that they claim, well, we're trying to develop a biological weapon so that we can develop a cure for that biological weapon, which never makes any sense, because what's the likelihood some other biological weapon by your factory, by your enemy, is making the exact same weapon that you're making? No, it's to design a weapon, and they do want a vaccine so that they only kill the enemy. I mean, that's what this is. And everybody kind of knows it. The greatest legal mind on this is Francis Boyle, a law professor at the University of Illinois, helped draft the U.S. law on the subject. The U.S. media won't let him anywhere near institute. I mean, he's more blacklisted than Chomsky is from mainstream press because he has detailed all the violations that have been occurring over the last 35 to 40 years in this precise space. For those Americans that don't know it, I mean, just go Google San Francisco when they decided to test out, dropping some things in the air, and unfortunately, some people ended up in the hospital, or check what they did with the New York subways, or I mean, this is an old habit. Check what they did with cancer patients. You don't just have to look at Tuskegee to look at the experimentation. Look at mustard gas in World War I. There's a wide range. Look at Agent Orange, of course, in Vietnam. Look at whatever happened in the major first Iraq War. All of these dynamics, there's a history of it, and they disguise biological weapons as biosafety labs. The fact that we had as many as it turns out we did, and in a poor, rundown, grifter country like Ukraine, the only reason you pick a place like Ukraine to locate those kind of things is you think you can get away with more than you could in another region, in another location. And so, I mean, and whether he had this evidence in advance or not, he played his cards very close to the vest. They didn't disclose. He didn't do your typical Western propaganda thing. Right. And it tells you something about Putin. The politically smart thing to have done would have been to have waited for the Donbass to be assaulted and attacked. Now, the consequence of that might have been that those people would have been wiped out that were still there by the time Russians could get in. The fact that he chose not to do that, it tells you something about what his mindset and mentality is, that he would rather that he doesn't care about the political cover for what he's going to do. He cares more about its political and military effectiveness in terms of protecting civilian life that is Russian by ancestry and political orientation. Indeed, if you look at where Russia occupies on the map so far, where they went in to dominate land-wise, it overlaps almost directly with Russian ancestry, with Russian language-speaking regions. You can go back to the 2004 Ukrainian election. And other than the region around Kiev, The rest of the areas where the Russian army has been able to easily enter corresponds to where the pro-Russian candidate, quote unquote, had the strongest support. And they tend to follow that track. It shows that Putin understands Ukraine. And there was a poll in Ukraine. And as you mentioned, Alexander, there isn't much. Where are the big protests in these regions? Where's the big personal pushback? Well, there was a poll taken back in January, and it asked Ukrainians, would you, 1, fight back militarily? 2, would you go and protest, strike? Would you, 3, leave? Or 4, would you do nothing? And in the East, it was less than 20% would even protest or fight back. I mean, they'd already said in the poll, a majority said they would either leave or they would welcome him. They wouldn't have a problem with it.
Exactly.
And that's mostly what's frankly happened, at least in the regions they have.
Exactly.
So far.
Exactly. If they were to go far to the west, it would be different. There would be real opposition, but that they've shown no indication so far. Here, I have to say, I disagree with people like Scott Ritter, for example. They've shown no indication so far that they're interested in going to the west. They're confining themselves to the eastern regions. They're fighting in those regions, and at the same time, and this is the thing which, as I said, has puzzled and bewildered everybody, they're negotiating. Now, I'm going to make an observation here. Robert is a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for much of my life. We perhaps understand that, maneuvering and taking strong positions and fighting things throughout, as we do in court, you can negotiate always at the same time. So perhaps this isn't so difficult for us to conceptualize. If you're talking about people in the media, though, they don't understand this in any way. And I think this is where they go wrong. I think that they think that war and diplomacy are opposites, whereas just as litigation and negotiation complement each other, war and diplomacy, at least as the Russian approach, complement each other as well. And I think if you once asked me, where do I get my skepticism? I perhaps ought to have added, Robert, that a legal training. If you worked in courts, and 12 years I was the duty solicitor of the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand, that does give you a certain perspective on things, which perhaps does make you more skeptical of many of the things that you hear. But anyway, I just wanted to say that, because I think approaching it in that kind of way perhaps helps you to understand it. You can go into court, you can fight out, you can say the most terrible things about each other, you can come up with every conceivable legal strategy, but a good lawyer always has the best interests of the client. And if you achieve the objective for that client through negotiation as well as through litigation, of course you do it. And in a sense, that's the Russian approach to this conflict. Now, I want to just ask you, Robert, and after you've commented on the point I've just made, but I would also like to ask about what you think about the long-term implications of all of this are going to be in the US, because I see gasoline prices, last time I looked, rising. We're going to have massive problems in Europe. Food prices are rising. Here, one can already start to sense that there's growing vertigo, if I can put it like that, amongst some of our political leaders. I happen to know that because I happen to know some of the people in the British political class, that they're starting to look down and they're starting to say to themselves, my God, where is this going? Do we have any of that kind of sense in the United States at the moment? Are people starting to say to themselves, well, just hold on a moment, is this really going to work out well for us in the US too? And I don't mean just for the US, I mean for us personally, politically, we who have done these things. And how do you think this is going to play out? What sense do you have about how this might play out in the midterms in November? Which for me, I mean, I'm always interested in American politics, putting aside even the geopolitics, because the US is such an interesting country and such an important one. So I would just generally like to know where you feel this is all going.
So as to the first point, in terms of the legal training being useful for seeing the world in a more, and as you've noted, Putin has legal training and has looked to the
Absolutely.
legal system of the West and has, some of that similar mindset and similar
Yeah.
approach, which he
Yeah.
revealed in Chechnya.
Yeah.
After they first did the bombings, he pulled
Yes.
back from that and employed a political strategy of aligning with key people within Chechnya to
Yeah.
isolate the Wahhabi terroristic group, and that's how he ultimately succeeded. And now is,
Yeah.
some people criticize him for it, but a pretty close relationship with the current leaders in Chechnya, which is
Yes.
interesting personality. But it's the Chechens. I don't know what you expect. That's as good as it's going to get.
Yeah.
But into the legal system, one of the number one things we're taught is strategic empathy, which
Yeah.
is you have to understand your adversary. You're opposing a witness, a juror, or a judge, but particularly your legal adversary, and you're both the opposite party and the opposite lawyer,
Mm.
in order to predict and preview what they're going to do, so that you can strategically adjust. You don't empathize just to empathize. You empathize for your own strategic self-interest. I think Putin employs this a lot, and I think the West does not. And I think that's why you see the gap in responses and what's taking place now. A lot of what the U.S. political opinion will be shaped by how this war flushes out in the end. Like if Russia collapsed and we were able to recolonize it, which is what we basically did in the 90s, probably most Americans would be happy with that. It would be, with you toppled the evil dictator or whatever. Now, politically, historically, that doesn't last very long, as Poppy Bush. He went in and cleared out Hussein from Kuwait, not for the reasons he said, but that's another story. Go back and research incubator babies and the long history of blatantly false stories that have propagated us into war. Remember the Lusitania, remember the Maine, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Gulf of Tonkin. It goes on and on and on and on. God bless it. And the ability for Americans to buy it and the West to buy it is always really quite impressive. Sad, but impressive. But, so some of what happens will impact it. But, Poppy Bush, even after he toppled Hussein in the sense of moving him out of Kuwait up to 91% approval, lost re-election less than a year later. So, or about 15 months later. And so I think even if that outcome were to occur, it wouldn't achieve the objective. I think in the West, there were two immediate, let's do a little bit further back. In terms of war, you have the neocon, neoliberal, Atlanticist elites who dominate the State Department, the think tanks, the academies, the media. The media sort of are watered down versions of it. They can articulate the sixth grade version of the ideas. And they live in their own small bubbles, as you can see on Twitter and see in the message boards that you're referencing, see in the publications. They write for foreign policy and foreign affairs and all this kind of thing. And they're the Bill Chris and most of them, I think what surprises some people is they agree on a lot of global policy. They'll disagree on, say, Iran. They'll disagree on, say, aspects to approach to the Arab world. They may disagree on aspects of Venezuela, but they'll agree in the core assumptions. I mean, there isn't a big difference between the Obama, Biden, and Trump administration hierarchy on a lot of these foreign policies. That's how Victoria Nuland is magically everywhere. She's there with Dick Cheney, the hated Dick Cheney by Democrats, and yet she gets a job in the Obama administration helping to stage the coup in Ukraine. A lot of her key people are the ones that lead Ukraine Gate against Trump to cause him to be impeached when he just second guesses their strategies. And now they're magically back again. So these elites, but they only represent a tiny, tiny section of the electorate. The ordinary person has no interest in this. They dominate the staffers on the Hill. They dominate the producers at Fox News. They dominate that world, the professional, bureaucratic, clerical class world. But they are generally disliked to the degree they're known in the ordinary working class, middle class voting bases of either Republican or Democratic Party. Now, the most active in the court of public opinion anti-war voices are either the anti-war left or the libertarian anti-war right. They too don't have big voting constituencies. They are just the most influential in the intelligentsia, in the court of public opinion, in the influencer world. That's where you can get good sources of independent information about wars and foreign conflicts, but they're not representing voting wise. The biggest anti-war voting constituency, and Americans are historically instinctively anti-war. They're not really that. There's a muscular macho wing of the Republican Party that goes back to, George Corley-Wallace, I'm going to let LeMay go crazy in Vietnam and we're just going to bomb the hell out of him. And Trump appealed to that group by saying, I'm going to bomb the hell out of ISIS, but then I'm going to get out of there. They get out of there as the stronger
Yeah.
part. People go back to the 1920s when we had a real
Yeah.
Republican Party on foreign policy in this country. Back when they had, war as a racket committee, they had special committees. Great Senator Gerald Nye, coming from the Norwegian tradition in North Dakota, Minnesota. And he held the reason why there was no chance of war during the 20s was because of how World War I had discredited itself in the American court of public opinion, but also because Republicans were notoriously, quote unquote, isolationists, which really meant they supported their founding fathers. I mean, our John Quincy Adams famously, we do not go searching for monsters abroad to destroy, lest we become the monster ourselves. And so I would call that anti-war populism. You could call it constitutionalism or some other things, but basically that's it. And it is the dominant political sentiment with a muscular macho subtext for some of them.
Yes.
Think Chuck Norris movies, Rambo movies, things like that. Across all the working classes, left and right, African American, Latino, white, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. That is the dominant motif.
Yes.
And historically, there's almost no war that has maintained political popularity in the United States. It's one of the understated phenomena. The Korean War became unpopular. The Vietnam War, of course, infamously unpopular. The first Iraq War was kind of a joke, but the second Iraq War, very unpopular, helped kill the Bushite Republican coalition, and the Mitt Romneys of the world still don't realize it's dead and it's a corpse. The only skepticism of Obama gave him a chance in that election in the first place. Despite the neocons saying, "Hey, Mitt Romney should be the new nominee." These people are actually saying this on the political right. People like Chuck Ross and some other losers. But that political populist streak is reflected in the fact there was a lot of skepticism of war. I mean, I come from the very bottom of East Tennessee. East Tennessee mountains, the only time they used to vote was when it was against a war, whether it was the Civil War, World War I, or World War II. They're like double their turnout. That is the strongest streak, and that's large parts of Appalachia, the old Scotch Irish. They're kind of like the Cossacks and Chechens of the Russian world in their own way. Very fiercely independent. Don't like to get involved in foreign conflicts in the U.S., especially because they figure they end up on the losing end of that stick. You go to that populist constituency on both the Democratic and Republican side, and they're likely their instinct will be to be skeptical of the war. That enhanced when they saw two things happen. When the same people who pushed COVID mania in the social media world started pushing war mania, there were a group of people who hadn't spent any time studying Ukraine and Russia, but bought into the caricature of Putin as this tin can dictator from Russia, who are like, hold on a second, why are these people telling me I've got to go to war? And then the second backup was seeing who the lineup for the war was. When it was George Soros, Klaus Schwab, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Mitt Romney, little Marco Rubio, the European Union, these NATO elites, it's all the people they hate. And it was like, whoa, hold on. They're like, that got people walking back, the Clinton Foundation starting back up so they can get back in on that Ukrainian grift. That's when a lot of people, and then there are people who remembered the Hunter Biden story, the long history of Ukrainian corruption involving the Biden family. So that, in what I would call the influencer portion of that populist base, started pushing back. You even have someone like Jack Posobiec, Polish, long history of Poles and the Ruskies not getting along. We can back to the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. I mean, heck, about Ukraine, they used to get into major fights. Putin's still blaming the Poles for parts of Ukrainian nationalism, as he did in that July letter. It's like, that was the Poles just trying to trick you into thinking you're not really Russian. Which is, he kind of whitewashed a little bit of the Queen, what the emperor did back then. But we'll put that aside for the moment. But you look at that whole, Posobiec, he's saying, hey, this is nonsense. When those people in the influencer portion of the populist base are pushing back, even people like Glenn Beck, who was a big pro-Iraq war guy, saying something's going on here that's wrong. This feels more like a great reset agenda than an honest war agenda, so on and so on. Will buy into the anti-Putin rhetoric, but isn't willing to buy into the pro-war rhetoric. You're seeing a sense of it. A smart Republican will do what Joe Kent is now doing and has been doing, which is pushing the populist line on war. But they're all, and J.D. Vance, to his credit, has stepped up. The rest of them, frankly, are wusses. Josh Hawley can kiss his political career goodbye pretending like Zelensky is an honest, serious next Churchill. I mean, come on.
I know.
It makes him look like a joke. It's not just that it's a bad policy decision. It makes you question his intellect, his capabilities of making good decisions. And the fact that 42 Republican senators signed on to some warmongering, they are like, I was trying to find an analogy because it's tough to find an applicable one, because if you go back to the 1920s, the Republican Party has a century, almost after the Civil War, from that point forward, we're often on the anti-war side of the equation. Deeply, especially European wars. Didn't want to get anywhere near any of those European wars. Those European entanglements, always a problem. Somehow that has disappeared from the representational voice. It hasn't. Trump won on this. It's like Trump won because everybody next to him was a neocon. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz. People are remembering this is who Ted Cruz is. His dad did have an interesting history. What was he doing down there with Oswald in New Orleans, as Donald Trump said before Indiana, to push Trump out the door, to push Cruz out the door. You look at all of that sort of background. John Kasich was. Only Paul represented the libertarian anti-war right. Of those other 17 candidates, or other 15 other candidates, all of them were warmongers. And they should have learned, okay, how did Trump go from 2% to beating the crap out of all of us? The number one thing that separated him was his foreign policy positions on trade and war. He stood down in South Carolina. I remember the media saying he's done because they challenged him. They said, do you still support the impeachment of George W. Bush? And the Republican imagination, South Carolina is a military country, and that must mean that they're pro-war, not realizing, half of vets are some of your strongest anti-war voices in the world, always have been. Go back to war racket and books like that. From the general. You would think they would recognize. What does Trump do? He doubles down and says, "Yeah, he should have been impeached." And what happens? He wins South Carolina by double digits. While Nikki Haley, who's endorsing little Marco, gets whooped and is embarrassed in her own home state where she's governor, and now she's making the war rounds, of course, as usual. So there's a massive disconnect between the Republican intellectual, political, representational elite and the ordinary Republican voter. And the smart Republican will be the one who who bridges that gap. That's why Joe Kent is going to benefit from this. J.D. Vance, I think, is going to benefit from this. Some other smart Republicans will benefit from this, but most of them are wusses. Most of them are hiding. Marjorie Taylor Greene is too busy making trades and war stocks to make. She's one of the top money makers at stocks she did deals with that are going to profit from the war. Not looking good, NTG. Not looking good. You look more like the AOC of the right every day. So so the people that are smart will be the ones that are on the anti-war and understand the rich populist history of this, as represented in our last president, Republican elected president. That's where I think it's going to go ultimately, because I don't think this war will go as planned. I think it will backfire in a bunch of ways. It will hurt us more than it will hurt the Russians ultimately, in the sense of consequential policies. I think the globalist agenda may suffer a severe setback, because their whole assumption was we'll build a globalism, and globalism will prevent war because we're going to have the keys. This elite at the top, George Soros talks about it all the time, as the IMF is the model for future world governance. And what we'll do is, if you ever misbehave, we'll just remove you from the global economy. You'll get crushed, and you'll have no choice but to come back in on our terms. What if Putin proves that's not the case? What does that mean? And look at which parts of the world, going back to those impartial jurors, Central America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. How many of those countries have issued sanctions against Russia? Pretty much none.
No. Robert, that's brilliant. And can I just say something? What you've said about America having this huge antipathy to war adventures. I think we always have to say this. It comes back to what you said at the start of the program. Americans will defend their country. They will act to defend their country in its own interests. When it's threatened, they will mobilize. They will fight like like people everywhere will fight for their country. What they are completely opposed to is being shipped around the world in order to fight some cause which, frankly, they have no interest in, because that's not what the United States is about. The United States was not created to be an empire. It was not created to be anything else but a peaceful place. That, by the way, is the fundamental difference between the US and Britain. Now, I live in Britain, and I've known many Americans of various different classes, and it has consistently struck me that in Britain, we are much more belligerent than Americans are. I say this to my British friends. They find this very difficult to understand, but it is true. And I'll say something else, because I know people from, of a certain age. The British were proud of their empire. They were more than willing to go to places like India, Afghanistan, Central Africa, parts of Latin America at times, do the sort of extraordinary things that they did there, because Britain was a monarchical, aristocratic society, structured, hierarchical, structured around power, structured around those kind of relations. We don't have that tradition of peaceful, democratic, republican construction that you do in the United States. And one of the great tragedies for me, and I speak as somebody who loves my country, which is Britain, which is where I live, is the extent to which, for me, so much of the American elite has been anglicized. Now, I know that sounds a strange thing for people to understand, but I genuinely believe it. And it also, by the way, struck me very forcefully. I'm just throwing in lots of things now, very forcefully during the first Trump impeachment, when people were citing British precedents. And they were citing British precedents in impeachment proceedings in Britain as if we're talking about the British Constitution, when we're talking about the American Constitution, which is a completely different thing. It is utterly different from anything that we have in Britain. And our entire legal, conceptual, philosophical, political tradition is utterly different from it. And it astonishes me the extent to which we in Britain have been able to capture intellectually so much of the American elite. If you're talking about neoconservatism and neoliberalism, be under no doubt about it, the origins of many of these things you can find not in some of the places that people say. They actually originate in Britain. They are part of the sort of outlook that the British elite historically had when they were rulers of the earth, or a quarter of it, and when they started to sense that their power was diminishing, and they said, "Well, who are the people who will keep us going?" And they turned to the Americans.
And that goes way back. I mean, you
That
talk about
goes
the
very way
turn of the
back.
20th century. You talk about the
Absolutely.
Pilgrim Society. The Rockefellers modeled themselves after the Rhodes Roundtable in part. The Council on Foreign Relations was formed in part related to that. There was a deep alliance between those groups, between sort of the Rhodes British Empire groups and American elites. And some of those American elites had foresight. They thought, well, we can replace the Brits in the empire structure. But very much, you're absolutely right, very much Anglophiles at heart. And particularly in the sort of the old Yankee elite, and then the WASP elite that took over the CIA and sort of whether you call it the national security state or the deep state or the military establishment, whatever you label it, they're the ones handpicking the first roster to Bilderberg in 1954. So these are the Dulles brothers, and they look to the British as their model. And very different than the ordinary American. Not only do you have sort of the old working class populism that goes all the way back to the backcountry, a lot of Scotch Irish, no fans of the Brits for various reasons, going back to your Rob Roy days. And then you have the Irish, you're big, again, not necessarily big British fans, right? So these were the working class political base of each party, totally different than this sort of old Beacon Hill Brahmin elite that the Kennedys waged war on from the time they were kids and kids going to Groton and those kind of schools. And it's very much so that you have this small elite that very much looks to the English Empire as a model, really, British Empire as a model, and you have the ordinary everyday working class American that's got no interest in it whatsoever.
No.
And you can gin up a fake poll. You can say, oh, hey, are you for a no-fly zone? Okay, it means less war. Okay, sure. You'll get 75% support. If you ask, are you for sending your son over to Ukraine to free the people of Ukraine from Russia? It's going to be 80% no thanks.
Yes.
So that's where, and America was proud of its independence and not being involved in every other country's wars. And it goes back to one of your earlier points you made. One of the reasons why American military strategy will sacrifice foreign civilians before they'll allow one American to die is because politically they know their DOA when the body bags start coming home with Americans in there and those American flag draped coffins. I mean, the W administration and others shut down film cameras even being able to film that because of how politically impactful it was after Vietnam, and partially also really during World War I and during the Korean War. Both very unpopular. I mean, one of the big myths is that wars are popular in America. Not really. No. The media and the elites do a good job of keeping Americans in the dark, so they don't know how many civilians we killed in the bombings of Somalia or Sudan or Serbia or Libya or Iraq or Syria or anywhere else. But down deep, if you look at these wars, as soon as Americans start dying, as soon as Americans start hurting, if it doesn't directly impact American security and safety in their minds, they're off the war train fast. I agree. Even right now, quarter of Republicans refuse to support anything related to Ukraine, which should have been a red flag to the Mitch McConnell warmongers up there and the Josh Hawley types who think he's the next president. This is not so popular. They're making the same mistakes they made during the lockdown issues. Early on, all these Republicans had their mouths shut about lockdown issues, about mask mandates, about vaccine mandates. They only came on board midway through when they realized how unpopular those mandates were. But relying on Fox News as a proxy is a bad idea unless you're watching Tucker Carlson.
Yeah. Is that what they're trying to do, Robert? Is they're trying to right now escalate and just keep the Americans in the dark and even keep Europeans in the dark? Because unless you really, really try, it's hard to get accurate information as to what's going on in Ukraine. And it is a very complex situation. I mean, for someone to really analyze what's going on and to come to some sort of educated understanding as to why this is happening, it takes effort. But it seems that, I mean, I'm getting the feeling that the Biden White House really wants to escalate this, even though they're saying they don't. And they say NATO's not going to get involved and we're not going to fight the Russians and it's going to lead to World War III. You then get a statement like, if Russia commits a chemical attack, then boy, are they going to pay a price. And everyone in the U.S., they seem like I don't know, they seem like they're on board with all of this, or, the caricature of Putin and the story that they've packaged. It seems that not everyone, a large majority of people have bought it, much like the pandemic in the beginning. At first, everyone did seem to buy it, and it took some time before, the narrative started to fall apart. I mean, but in a war, once it starts, it's going to be too late.
Well, it's a foreign country. So like almost any place in the world, foreign policy is where the ordinary person is going to be the most ignorant because they don't have life experience to check it against. They don't have personal relationships, personal history. They didn't study that history. It's going to be very rare that it used to be in America in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. We had classical educations. And it was part of the reasons why so many of our initial American groups were so opposed to foreign wars. No, not always opposed to domestic wars. I mean, I told people if the roles were reversed and we were in Putin's position in Russia and somebody was doing to us what Ukraine had been doing, we would have gone in there 5 years earlier and would have been a lot more ruthless, quite frankly, about it. And when people say, well, there's no legal political precedent for that, it's called the Republic of Texas. I mean, a bunch of Americans went down there to another place, part of a foreign country, decided they didn't like their treatment, declared independence. The Mexican government didn't like it. And what did we do? We sent in troops. That's what we did. I mean, my Tennessee forebears went down to remember the Alamo. I mean, that's what that all was about. That was illegal invasion, technically, of another country's jurisdiction so that we could take it over. In fact, most of the Western United States was established on that legal principle. Heck, U.S. Supreme Court case law, when determining legal title, determined the law of conquest governed. I mean, so to hear people act like legally it's always illegal to invade, it can never be right, and it's like this is totally ahistorical, especially from the American perspective. But I I think the ordinary, like before Trump, Putin had a 2% approval rating in the United States. So his demonization over 18 years, and then you add to this Hollywood, which Putin and Lavrov have both mentioned just specifically to certain degrees. Definitely Lavrov recently, and it's who is the number one enemy in almost any Hollywood film? It's a Russian. It's a Russian mob. It's Russian this, Russian that. They were the politically correct enemy. You didn't want to list to anybody in Europe because you're trying to tap those markets. You couldn't list anybody from any other part of the world because then you're being discriminatory and prejudicial. The days of 24 and after 9/11 were gone. You couldn't make that your enemy very often. It had to be a Russian, even if it was a terrorist. It was somehow a Russian terrorist. All of that. So there's been so much demonization. The only thing that changed was Trump. Trump got up to double-digit levels of approval still, but only you're talking about 11, 15%, that kind of level. Most people still believe the complete caricature of Putin. They think he gets people killed everywhere. They think he has $200 billion hidden in a bank account in Switzerland. They think things that are illogical to think. You can have a skeptical view of Putin and say if money was his motivation, he would have gone to the West because that's where the motivation is. He would have aligned Russia with the Great Reset. And then he wouldn't have to be, he would be like Abramovich. He would have 4 English Premier League clubs. The choices he made show that money can't be his motivation. You still disagree with his policies, but money doesn't explain his course of conduct. But in the average American believes all that. And they think, and they've been taught and trained and tutored to believe that if anyone says differently, disregard that's Russian propaganda. Disregard that some Putin apologist, some Putin bootlicker, all that kind of jazz. And I tell people, look for in the chat sections, people's response. Do they respond with facts? Do they respond with history? Do they respond with policy? Do they respond with argument? Or do they respond with emotion and name calling? And 90% of it's emotion and name calling because that's what they really have to cling to. They don't have empirical evidence. They don't have logical argument. They don't have historical reference. All they have is little girl dead. Little girl dead, bad, 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 Russian bad, right? And it's like, I was telling people the other day, if it's always wrong for civilians to die in war to such a degree that anyone who could be responsible for that war has to be on a war crime tribunal, like the British journalist told Lavrov. I mean, she said, when are you preparing your defense for the International Criminal Court? And it's like, we dropped nuclear bombs on 2 cities. I mean, and I frankly, I'm still on the side that it was likely, I lean this way, likely the strategically correct decision. One can make arguments that it wasn't, a lot of good arguments that it wasn't, clearly morally horrific in the sense of its consequence. But it's like, given that, how in the world do anybody who thinks it's okay at all to have actually used nuclear weapons can't believe that any civilian death means that anybody who's responsible for that war must go to a war crime tribunal. I mean, we firebombed Dresden during World War II. I mean, we didn't limit ourselves. We, of course, did the same in North Korea, did the same in Vietnam, did the same in the major Iraq war, did the same in aspects of Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia. And those are just the formal hot wars, right? Not even to talk about the various covert wars we supported around the world. It's like my own view has been I don't have as much of a problem necessarily with some of those decisions the U.S. made. But at a minimum, if I think there's anything that was permissible in those decisions, I can't sit around and say any civilian death is automatically death. Yet that's the mindset the ordinary person is in. That interaction between that British reporter, the same one who Jordan Peterson embarrassed a couple of years ago, she's somehow still there. Between her and Lavrov was very revelatory. Because her only argument wasn't a policy argument, wasn't a historical argument, wasn't an empirical argument. It was little girl dead, you bad. Little girl dead, you bad. It's like, that's not how any Realpolitik version of war or foreign policy would approach things, nor is it how the law approaches things. You can't use indiscriminate violence. You can't target civilians. But otherwise, I have seen no evidence that the Russians have committed any war crimes at all so far. Because they've done neither one of those. They've gone out of their way to avoid it, even at the expense of their own soldiers' lives.
I've heard, by the way, I mean, I don't know whether this is even true, but I've heard that the US military have come to the same view that so far there's not been a case of war crimes. Robert, what's going to happen if we have a recession in the United States? If all of this creates a high inflation and a big recession situation, I mean, what are people going to say about that? I completely understand that if American soldiers were to of the Ukraine, then there'd be a massive revulsion of feeling against it, and you'd have a massive anti-war campaign. But will people put together the dots? Will they say, well, this recession, this inflation we've already had? You remember the administration came in, inflation would be transitory. We turbocharge the economy. It would be growing at double-digit rates, the economy, not the inflation. That was what they were saying last year. Now we're going to have another surge of inflation on top of that inflation which we already have. Will people be able to put together the dots and say that this is, to a great extent, the consequence of what the administration is doing? One of the most interesting things that Putin has said recently, and he said, don't blame me for the fact you've got higher gasoline prices in the United States. I've got absolutely nothing to do with that. Even the fact that you've restricted my exports of gasoline to the United States is not the cause of this. It's your own policies, your own miscalculations in the United States that are the result. It was one of the most interesting comments that he's made recently. I mean, he made it, I think, just yesterday or the day before yesterday. But will people, because I already get the sense that this is the latest thing. You've got high inflation. If inflation is going to be 10, 12, 15%, it's not Biden's fault. It's Putin's fault. Will people accept that? Will they believe that?
Well, I think the problem they have is, like, let's say you even had a wartime atmosphere in the United States, and that they could justify that with sort of war hysteria. If we look back at U.S. elections right after a war's conclusion, 1920, 1946, 1952, at least those three for sure, and you could arguably add 1992 and 2008 to that equation. The party that was considered responsible for the war got wiped out. So, I mean, like, that's where, like, I always tell some of my, is like, don't get caught up in some of the political, like, I've talked to Senate candidates here, talked to House candidates here, talked to people running for office here. Said, don't get caught up in the short fields. Like, you can agree or disagree with my policy analysis of Russia and Putin and all that. I was like, just let's look at the domestic politics. No American president, no American party, no American politician, even after a successful end to a war, has been rewarded by the American public. They've been punished every single time without fail. And so it's like, why anybody thinks that even if you got the benefit of a wartime hysteria and a successful war, they've all been punished. And part of the reason is what you mentioned on the economic consequence. Bottom line is, ordinary American doesn't care quite why. It only cares that it's happening. And for the ordinary American, any economic suffering, they're going to blame on the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. And the Biden administration has made it worse by doing things like, okay, because of some foreign war, I have to pay more at the pump. Why? Stephen Colbert can say, oh, $1 is okay for my conscience, and ordinary person, middle America doesn't agree with you, Colbert. So that mindset is not going to translate well. And then you add to the fact that even though it doesn't quite correlate technically as to why the prices are where they're at right now, for the ordinary American, the fact that the Biden administration has made a big deal of being anti-oil and anti-gas and anti-development in the United States to such a degree that now they're going down there begging the Venezuelans and the Iranians to bail them out, is that they're going to blame that on the Biden administration. So I think that this is a temporary power grab they can use and get a little bit of a boost in the polls, but it will backfire over time. It's like every other tactic he's made. I mean, he's making Jimmy Carter look like a very good manager of public affairs. Biden, I think, may go down as the worst president in American history. He's on path to actually achieve that.
I fear you're right. And can I just say, Jimmy Carter is exactly what it reminds me of. Now, I remember, I have a long memory, and I remember 1980 when the way we started 1980. The Soviets went into Afghanistan, a big mistake, by the way, a huge mistake that the Soviets made then. But anyway, they went into Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter absolutely made a massive play about this. He imposed sanctions. People don't remember this. He blocked grain exports to Russia.
He hurt American wheat farmers for a decade.
Exactly. And of course, what happened was that he lost the election. As I said, there was a huge boost in his popularity at the first weeks of 1980, and he seemed to be dominating, and then everything started to fall apart, and it fell apart very fast. And of course, he lost, and he didn't just lose; he lost big. So, I think this is exactly what's going to happen with Biden. But how much damage is he going to do along the way? Because this is the other thing that utterly depresses me. We're having extraordinary decisions now. Seizing the reserves of a G20 central bank is an astonishing thing to do. I sort of intellectually thought that it might happen, but when it did happen, it took my breath away. And that kind of big move comes with consequences. And obviously, it's not one of them, for example, is that if you see this freeze up in oil markets that happened for weeks afterwards, and still continue to some extent, people won't touch Russian oil, even though it hasn't been sanctioned. Even at that point, it hadn't been sanctioned. When people saw that they went after the forex reserves of a central bank, they said this lot will do anything. Because I think I'm right. I think forex reserves held by central banks are covered by sovereign immunity. But clearly that isn't going to slow down or stop this administration. That they did this extraordinary thing without thinking through the effects and the consequences. That staggered me. So how much damage is he going to do between now and then? Because I have to say, if this carries on for another 2.5 years, what's going to be left?
Yeah, no doubt. I've described it as like that there was a lot of talk about whether the West successfully provoked Putin into the conflict so that they could have a pretext to impose these massive economic sanctions and prove that the globalist model dominates the world and take out the Russian bear as an example of it. Because the Russian bear didn't want to join the family circus of Klaus Schwab, that Russian bear had to be killed or made into a colony like it was effectively in the 1990s. But I would said that the flip side could also be true. What if Putin provoked the West to expose itself? Because if you wanted to prove to the world that the globalist financial system is really manipulated by a small group of people that don't really respond to or aren't and are not functionally democratically constrained, and you wanted to prove that this group of people was unreliable, untrustworthy, and didn't believe either in the rule of law or the neutrality of the dollar or the independence of the financial system from political actors. It's supposed to be what central banks are all about, right? They're not governed by politics. They're independent of politics. That's the whole premise and predicate for central banks and why we need them, by golly. If he wanted to disprove that and prove that that was all a lie, he couldn't have done anything better than what the West has done to him in the last 2 weeks. They've proved to the world that the dollar is not trustworthy at all. They proved to the world that the Western financial system is not trustworthy at all. They've proven to the world that the central banks are not trustworthy at all. They've proven that they will violate any of their so-called cardinal rules. That this is about them having control, and that their goal with globalism isn't to have peace and democracy to the world, it's to have as much control as they possibly can as many people. Who's going to be gung-ho for a digital currency when they've just seen this? Hold on a second. You want me to give you, the government, the power to deny me the ability to go pay my water bill if you don't like my last tweet? I don't think so. So single-handedly in one move, they have discredited the entire Western financial system and its entire predicates and premises and propaganda. And it's by their own action. As you pointed out, it's a quasi-suicidal action. But they are unaware of it. Like you see it in these Twitter threads and other message boards and other commentary and some of the articles. They believe that they're winning. They believe it's like Baghdad Bob. They're not just saying it on the military side. They think it's true on the financial side. So they think they are proving their point that they dominate the world when they don't understand, as people like Jim Rogers, Jim Rickards, a wide range of independent economic analysts have said, you just destroyed the whole model. You've just told the whole world, don't put your money in Western banks. Don't invest in Western countries. They'll take it away. Ask Abramovich. All of a sudden, he can't even do anything with his own team in Chelsea.
Incredible.
do you really need Chelsea fans pissed off on you? I mean, there are worse fans in England. That's definitely true.
True enough.
I wouldn't have messed around. I bet if Abramovich owned Millwall, they wouldn't have issued the sanctions. They don't want those people showing up at the door. But that whole thing, they have, like, a Mark Moss does a lot of Bitcoin analysis, digital, etc. And he's been arguing for a long time the system is untrustworthy. His first point right out of the gate with the sanctions, and he could care less about Russia, Ukraine, politics, etc. He was like, they've just destroyed trust. And we have a financial system that is more built on trust than it ever has been. Because nobody's got gold other than the Ruskies sitting in their vaults for the most part. The whole financial system is based on trust. We have the repo lapses, as George Gammon has been documenting. Repo fails have skyrocketed to the highest level since the pandemic. And that was the number one cue that the whole financial crisis was about to blow up, was all of a sudden something as simple as big banks don't trust each other about their collateral. And because trust is critical. We have killed trust in the Western financial system. And I don't think it's ever coming back.
No.
I mean, the question is, where else do you go? Because it's not like it's easy to trust either Russia or China or Brazil or these other societies or economies. But what it's done is it's driven it. They know now without doubt they can't trust the West. And if somebody's smart, like there is talk of, if the Russian, Chinese, and Indians got together and formed a currency that was based on gold, that was independently accessible outside of those nations' vaults, if you will, it would be a mighty interesting economic world to live in. If Putin decides to price oil in silver or gold rather than dollars, what might happen? What happens to the petrodollar if the Saudis and the UAEs and the rest don't just fail to return Biden's phone calls while they return Putin's phone calls, but decide to move away from the dollar as the means of denominating the value of oil? They've assumed the reason why. My guess is why, while Putin has probably game planned every scenario under the sun in terms of anticipation, at least I presume so. If he hasn't, he may be in some trouble. But but it's more likely that he has, given his history. My guess is these Western, I mean, like, some people ask me why I am so skeptical of the intellectual competency of these people in terms of broadly. They're good mathematicians. They just don't understand the real world in terms of their logic and their thinking. I mean, I went to school with all these kids at Yale, and I was shocked at their lack of basic competence in terms of understanding the world, understanding things in a broader context. They lacked real world intelligence. Going back to William F. Buckley's joke, give me anybody out of the phone book rather than any student at Harvard. It's the same dynamic. And that I don't think these people have game planned it. So I don't think they understand what they've done. I don't think they've understood. The fact that we went begging to Venezuela and Iran so fast in such a humiliating fashion was a sign that, oh my God, they hadn't thought this through at all.
No. Wow. No, I mean,
Go ahead, Alex. I mean, my only point is, I totally agree. The fact that they went to Venezuela and to Iran, to me, just says that there is no plan. There is no plan. And that astonishes me, because you're not only talking about the United States, all the institutions, all the think tanks. You're also talking about Europe and Brussels. You're telling me, out of all of these people, all of them, not one of them understood what would happen if they did this the way you broke it down, Robert. That's the part that just, I mean, it's
just like the elites before World War I. You go back and read their stuff, and it never dawned on them. Maybe this will backfire on us. I mean, it's not in their brains.
Because the elites today that run things are like the elites before 1914. They're not connected to the commercial and political pulse of their countries. They are, in effect, I'm going to say it straightforward, aristocracies of a kind. They are very, very remote from the lives of people. They don't understand commerce. Exactly. They don't. Well, exactly. Let them die Teslas. They don't really understand how markets they work. They don't understand how businesses work. They don't grasp how things are interconnected, what logistics are like. I was told, I haven't seen this, but I was told that after the decision was taken on the central bank to seize its reserves, the Federal Reserve Board, this is Tom Longo who told me, by the way, and I mean he says that he's actually seen the paperwork, and he's a trader. He said that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, made it absolutely clear that they had not been consulted about that decision.
Oh yeah. I mean, even Jamie Dimon came out, the Chase bank had said he wasn't consulted, and that this could backfire. He tried to say it diplomatically because it was PR public. But I mean, and to my knowledge, none of the big banks, well, to my understanding, Wall Street banks were against this. And the main reason they were against it is because they understand the trust factor. I mean, especially after we went through the global financial crisis. That's all. Our economy in the modern age, particularly our financial system, is built almost entirely on trust. And that's the difference between the West and the East. The East has real resources they can turn to for economy. They have real production in China they can turn to. All we have is trust, and we just burn it live.
Gosh.
How much time do you have, Robert?
Oh, I'm free today.
Okay, cool. Let's continue.
So I'm game for as long as you guys can last.
Let's do it. We've got for quite a few hours.
It's still nighttime where you guys are at, right?
Yeah. I have to add a caveat. I do have a visitor, which I have to see at some point. But
how much time?
I can go on for another half hour. Certainly.
Okay. Let's do another half hour. Alexander, Robert, what is the end game for the Biden White House?
Humiliating defeat. I mean that's it.
What do they?
Alexander's question. The only question is how much
defeat Russia? You mean humiliating defeat towards Russia?
No,
what does the Biden White House want to accomplish?
They will end in humiliating defeat. The worst.
What do they want to accomplish?
I think.
What do they think in their minds they're going to do?
I think they are going to. In their minds, something's going to work, but this is because you have most of the key staffers are West Wingers. And what I mean by West Wingers is they grew up on watching the show West Wing. When I was an intern, 1993, Clinton White House, and no, I did not meet Monica Lewinsky to anybody you ask. And I knew that story was bogus from day one because none of us got to hang out with Clinton, even though I ran into him like 3 times. But we weren't getting special invites to hang out at the movie theater, so everybody knew what that was from day one. But the West Wing was the beginning of the professionalization of politics writ large. The people used to run politics in America were your James Carville types. Your Louisianans, your Irishmen, your New Yorkers, you're from the street, your guys who learned the game the hard way. This, came up in the old school political machines, your big Jim Farleys, your Mark Hannas, those kind of guys, more so than professional class, clerical class, bureaucratic class, elites who are privileged, who grew up in upper middle class homes, went to elite either liberal arts or Ivy League schools, then got nice little internships and clerkships, either whether they were going the media route or the political route, and they took over the political class. And I was seeing the beginnings of it in DC in 1993 when I was there. I hated these people. I still hate these people. Some of it's, some of it's based on legitimacy, some of it's biased, but they deserve to be hated. Trust me. But their continuous takeover. That's why they'll often make references. Jack Posobiec notes this. Inside the White House, they'll often say, "What would have happened in this West Wing version?" That's why, the fact that Zelensky is in the middle of all this is very apropos. You have people who really think of the world in terms of Hollywood scripts, and the problem is these people are part of the Hollywood script writers who have been terrible for the last decade. At writing terrible movies and ruining great franchises. I mean, how do you ruin Star Wars? These people managed to do it. That's their gift. So they're not only obsessed with a screenwriter view of the world, they're bad at it. They're not even good at it. So they'll keep going in that world, and they're still reinforced with the certain the media will still reinforce all their biases and prejudices. Their communities reinforce this. I mean, this is where Charles Murray's work about the complete disconnect of elites. They don't know anybody who served in the military. They don't know anybody who smokes cigarettes. They don't know anybody who doesn't wear masks. That kind of mindset. So I think they won't be cognizant of it, but I think they're going to get hammered in 2022, not only at the congressional level, but more consequentially for them for 2024 at the gubernatorial level. They're going to lose in Wisconsin. They're going to lose the governorships of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, and Florida. 3 of those once again, but the other 3 will have changed sides. And that means going into 2024, they're in trouble. And I think they're going to get killed. They have one problem the Clintons did is they didn't want any competition. So they purged the party of a lot of smart voices, such that all you had that was an independent was somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's one step in the nursing home. And has been notably absent on this on the anti-war left side. That's the other side that hasn't been represented. Where is the anti-war left in Congress? That used to be strong just a decade ago or so. There were people who voted against the Iraq War in 2003 at its peak popularity. So I think that the Democrats don't have anybody to replace Biden. Every time Kamala Harris sticks her head up, everybody's reminded why she was a terrible choice, and she's kind of like what Agnew was for Nixon. Everybody, anytime they got the moment to impeach Nixon, they're like, "Oh my God, that means President Agnew." So that was insurance against impeachment. As soon as he got rid of Agnew, they impeached him because he had Jerry Ford there. Though they tried to put Nelson Rockefeller in, which would have been the conspiracy of all conspiracies if Rockefeller had become president. But you look at that dynamic. Harris is not an option.
No.
Dementia candidate Joe is not really a viable option. There's nobody out in the wings. I mean, are you going to put Buttigieg? Buttigieg is going out there just saying, buy a Tesla. Come on, everybody, just buy a Tesla. I mean, everybody's doing the comparison you just made to the old French aristocracy about let them eat cake. They're saying, just let them buy Teslas. Right. Everybody's got $100,000 sitting in the bank. I mean, it's just insane. And people should figure out where they make those batteries, folks. Find out where some of the key ingredients that goes into batteries. It's a certain country in the East that has a lot of the key resources. So these people are just clueless about the world. So I don't think they'll be cognizant of how much they're collapsing until they ultimately. And remember, this was Carter, 1980. Remember the big odds. If I could have bet, I would. I was only 6 years old at the time, but if I could have bet, by golly, I would have on that election. If the polls had Carter ahead the whole time,
Absolutely.
Ronald Reagan, before this orange man bad, Reagan was orange man bad. He's a washed up actor. And then Reagan won by a landslide, almost 10 points. That's what we're heading to in 2024, whether it's Trump or DeSantis. It'll be one of those two. And that depends, honestly, more on Trump than it does on DeSantis. And it's going to be a wipeout. So I think that's where we're going politically. That's the end game. But the big question is what Alexander asked. How much damage, how much scorched earth do we deal with in the interim? How much damage is there by the time you get some sanity back in the White House in 2025? And that's where it's frightening. I mean, you have media people saying, well, maybe we could survive a limited nuclear war.
Yeah.
It's like the George C. Scott meme came back. I'm not saying our hair won't get brushed up a little bit. Like I said, what we're living through a merger of the movies Weekend at Bernie's and Dr. Strangelove. And we just pray to God it doesn't end quite like Dr. Strangelove does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what happens if we have a big Republican sweep in the midterms? I mean, does that act as a brake on what the administration is doing? I say that because at the moment, I don't really see much opposition in Congress. On the contrary, Congress seems to be busy encouraging every conceivable action. I mean, apparently the new, utterly meaningless decision, by the way, to revoke Russia's most favored nation status, I mean, which has never really been effective. But anyway, I mean, that apparently that seems to have started in Congress, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was actually floated by the administration. But anyway, there doesn't seem to be any opposition to this in Congress. Does Congress act as a brake in these kind of situations? Could it do?
I think so, but indirectly. There won't be enough populists in the House to do what the Republican populists did in the 1920s, which was to put the whole war machine on trial. I mean, we actually had committees called the War Racketeering Committee. I mean, things you couldn't even imagine in the U.S. today. There'll be people, more and more voices like that, but they will be in the small minority. But, however, I think practically they will be under massive political pressure because of the dual impeachments of Trump. And people should pay attention to who was involved in Russiagate, involved in the impeachment. See if, like, for example, the British television recently had a former MI6 expert to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict on. And who was it? It was a man by the name of Christopher Steele. So, I mean, it's amazing people haven't put together some of the, drawn together some of these dots. But
Chalupa, Vindman. I mean,
they're all back.
Fiona Hill. I mean, just on and on and on. They're all the interconnected parts. It's the reason why they were obsessed with it. I mean, they were more obsessed with this. It's really a testament to William Appleman Williams' theory about the contours of American history, about obsession over examples beyond their immediate impact on the actual global stage. That some American foreign policy leaders in the post-World War II era were obsessed with making examples or countering examples than they were broader impact of a particular country. Hence, Cuba becomes very consequential, even though Cuba as a country is not very consequential in America. aside from when they put a few nukes there. But I think in politically, I think that their DOA, I think they will do a lot of damage in the process, but I think the way the House will be a check won't be a direct on foreign policy. It'll be indirect on foreign policy because of what happened to Trump. There is massive pressure on the Republican House to impeach Biden. And what happens when you do an impeachment is it just drives the Senate process, and the whole process takes a month, 2 months out of the whole calendar. And the easiest place to impeach Biden would be some of these Ukraine-related issues. That would be part of the temptation, will be to include particularly the biolabs as an example. Did he know about the biolabs, lie about the biolabs, fail to secure the biolabs, so on and so forth? And then because the other aspect of Ukraine is, of course, his corruption, the most proof of it is in Ukraine. And, I wonder if those prosecutors in Kiev are burning the files because I would be. Unless some of them want to keep it for their own leverage, right? I mean, that's what the Nazis did. Some of your big Nazi people kept certain leverage. So either when the Soviets came in or the U.S. came in, they had some leverage so they could stay above ground. There's more evidence there. There's more proof there. There's people who know where the bodies are really buried there. That's what Trump was just trying to. We know that because they wouldn't have impeached him just for him asking about it. Just Trump asking Zelensky, I'd be kind of curious about this. All of a sudden, they got to impeach him. It means it's like Victoria Nuland jumping ahead. When Rubio, maybe to the surprise of Rubio, but Nuland was like, I got to get this out, that there's these labs there because they got proof of it, and we're going to get humiliated around the world. So I'll just recharacterize them as biological research facilities that the Ruskies may try to misuse to do something bad. Not that, we kind of had some bio safety labs, research labs. But we're scared for the Ruskies getting them. So they're research labs? What research was being done there? And apparently bats. What if it turns out there was coronavirus type research there that could, correspond? Remember the original Chinese allegation with Wuhan is it came from the U.S., right? They backed off of that. But what if there is a tie between U.S. involvement in, we already know there is at Wuhan. The only question is the scale and scope and knowledge of it. So all of those things are tempting impeachment topics. Tempting impeachment subjects. So I think we won't be able to directly restrain it through a Republican House because most of them are still, part of a globalist agenda that they don't even fully appreciate. But because of their need to impeach Biden, because of what happened to Trump, impeachment now will be tit for tat going forward. Once they did it twice to Trump, once opposite party has control, they're going to have to impeach to satisfy their political base. So I think impeachment will derail some of these foreign adventures. But no guarantee. And so it is the question of, do we yet have a Dr. Strangelove ending for this Weekend at Bernie's film?
I can't believe that. I mean, I'm going to say something straightforwardly about this, just to answer that particular point. I mean, there's a lot of people in the American military who I have little respect for, but I think that there is a core of extremely intelligent people, particularly those. And I've seen, interviews that they've given people who are in overall charge of the US's strategic forces. And I found them extremely impressive people. I think they fully understand the danger of all of this. And I think if they get an order from the president, for example, to go down that particular route, I think they will start telling the president, I'm sorry, this isn't an appropriate order. And if you persist with it, well, we've got, people who might want to have a word with you because what you're proposing is insane. And I think the same people are in touch with their opposite numbers in Moscow. And I think those people in Moscow are similarly level-headed and wise. So I cannot quite believe that we are going to find ourselves in that situation. I mean, I know that sounds complacent perhaps, but I have much more trust in the uniformed military in the United States on these sort of issues than I do in the political leaders.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost unimaginable. It's just no longer zero, which is unsettling.
Yeah, it is very unsettling. That I must admit, I do agree. I absolutely agree. I completely agree with that. But as I said, I don't think we're going to get there. What we will probably find is that we made all this, mad rush of decisions this March, of course, being the month of Mars, the god of war. And then, of course, the summer will start to drag on. We're going to see massive problems with food prices. I think that you and I, Robert, are on the mailing list of the same gentleman who sends us all the things about chemical fertilizer, which have been incredibly interesting. And can I just say, I mean, he's been absolutely right. I'm not going to mention his name but I think we both know whom I'm talking about. Anyway,
Oh yeah, I
that's all
mean,
going to
we
start.
talked about it pre-war based on
Yeah,
before all
yeah,
this, and now all of a sudden
We did
people
a
are
show
waking
on
up.
it.
absolutely.
Yeah, did a whole show, and it's
Yeah.
people waking up. Oh, it's not just fuel. It's not just oil and gas that Russia sits
Yeah.
on. It's things that are critical and essential and integral for a wide
Yeah.
range of things, including particularly fertilizers. And
Fertilizer.
historically, food inflation has been the number one political destabilizer over
Yeah.
world history.
Absolutely. And you know, it's going to start hitting in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and it's going to start hitting in Europe. And I think more severely in Europe than in the US, because I think in the US you still make most of your own food. That's my impression. I mean, I may be out of date here.
Oh yeah, I
But
mean,
in Europe,
I think the
we
U.S.
don't.
U.S. will take a little bit of a hit on some food price. Well, we have a food price problem independently. So that I mean,
Yeah.
inflation is in real inflation is now actually as high as it was under Carter. If you use like shadow stats and places like that where they use the same formula because we changed the inflation formula to make it not look as bad over the years. But if we use the same formula as the 1970s, we now have hit last month a higher inflation rate than we've ever seen since the 1970s.
Yes.
And then you've got stagflation problems because if the Fed raises interest rates, that helps sink the economy. But if they don't raise interest rates, inflation keeps going afoot. But the federal put is increasingly important to the stock market valuation where 401ks and retirements are tied into. So there we are in a bad position that has only been really badly impacted by our response. It's not just the war by itself wouldn't have been that big of an impact. It's our response to the war that has jittered so much of the economy.
This is the extraordinary thing. I mean, I said in a program that we did, I think, which is that governments, once upon a time, their job was to make the lives of the people that they governed better. Our governments have been doing the exact opposite. I mean, you know, over an issue, Ukraine, which, all right, people, I'm not going to say they're not interested in it, but it's not essential. It's not existential for them. And, you know, coming back to Russia, this is a fundamental difference because Russians care about Ukraine. I mean, you know, they have incredibly close links with that country. There are many, many people who have families there. They share so much with each other. They care about Ukraine in a way that it is simply not practical to expect us to do. So I think in Britain, we're a much more belligerent society than the US is. We're much more outspoken. We always want to strike poses, do all sorts of things. We want to use the US because we don't have that power ourselves. We always want to use the US to do it for us. So just as, you know, Blair was goading Bush to go into Iraq, so Johnson has been goading Biden to take the hardest possible line on this Ukrainian thing. But
do you think it will save Boris's career there or extend it there in the UK?
In the short term, in the medium term, it will merely mean that his political career will end even more disastrously. This is my own personal view. Already, we're looking at, as I said, 54% increases in household fuel prices on the 1st of April. That's already factored in. We're already seeing shortages in certain food items. Now, I'm going to just disclose something. I mean, I've recently become the father of 2 twin girls. So over the last 3 days, we've been struggling to find milk powder, baby milk powder. I mean, we're starting to see shortages starting to reappear again. We had shortages at the start of last year when the inflation began to take off. We had shortages during the pandemic. We're starting to see more shortages again. Things are starting, not quite so visibly, but they're starting to disappear from the shops because this is an effect of inflation. Because as prices rise through the chain, companies that produce things struggle because, you know, the inputs affect output. One always has to understand that if you've worked in logistics, which, by the way, I've also done, you understand immediately how this can translate into shortages. So we're starting to see shortages start to work their way through. And how do those shortages ultimately resolve themselves? They resolve themselves through much higher retail prices. Now, my wife, for the first time in a long time, traveled on the London Underground because, it's been very restricted and there have been all sorts of concerns about this. But she took the London Underground. And again, she was stunned by how high prices on London Underground have increased. One journey into central London now costs £5. What's that, $7?
Yeah.
So, and this is only the start of this process. So eventually, it's all going to translate sometime in the autumn into a severe political crisis in Britain. Fundamental problem is that the British system depends much more than the American. Remember, we're a parliamentary system. It depends on Her Majesty's government having a loyal opposition. Well, we have a loyal party, but it is not an opposition. The Labour Party has been supporting the government in every single one of the steps that it's taking. So I predict, it's the only prediction I can make, if I can make any kind of sense of this, is that sometime around the autumn, we're going to see a massive crisis with the political class, and that could provide all sorts of openings for people at, both ends of the political spectrum. And they've been intimidated into silence at the moment, and it's difficult to express the volume of hysteria there's been in Britain. Is much worse than in the States. I can compare media there with media here, and we don't have the huge raft of independent media that you still have in the US. So people have been intimidated into silence, but come the autumn and winter, as the bills start to come in, as people struggle with mortgage costs, which are also rising, with household bills, with rising food prices, you're going to start to see an undoubted political effect starting to clock in. And if people start then talking about, well, it's all the fault of Mr. Putin and we must tighten our belts, and that the European Union is now saying that, the way we've got to deal with this is to reduce temperatures, so, the heating temperatures have to be lowered by a degree. And if winter comes...
the other thing is, I guess, how much do the British recognize, ordinary person in Britain, recognize how much the London financial services was built up on being the independent place for everybody in the globe to go? To where now, at one point, half of all real estate over $10 million sold in London was sold to Russians. Right? When you tell the Russians, and by extension, every other rich person around the world, particularly places like the Middle East, places like Africa, places like Asia, came to London because they saw London as a place that they could protect their money. Now sees London as an imminent threat to their money. What happens to the global power of the London financial system by all of this? And doesn't it have longer ramifications for not only political power, but local politics?
Right. Okay. Straight away, you have to divide Britain here. Outside London, people hate London, and they hate the City of London. And as far as they're concerned, if the City of London has a crash, well, too bad for them. The reality is, in London itself, the entire economy revolves around the financial community. We're much more interconnected with the financial community in Britain, in London, than we are even in New York. I just say that because, remember, the United States is a continental economy. Britain is not. So the financial market here, the financial services industry, is a much larger employer. It's much more important to the economy than it is in the US. And I know lots of people whose work is entirely based upon the London housing market, and of course the high-end London housing market. one of my best friends is somebody who Alex has met, who's an estate agent, and his entire business revolves around this, and he employs 7 people. He just does that. He finds niche businesses for rich people. So it's going to have a massive effect on the way in which the London economy works. And if we go to those people outside London, it's going to affect them too, even though they don't perhaps fully understand it. One of the reasons why the Conservatives won, and won so big in working class areas in Northern England, in the Midlands, was obviously there was Brexit, and that must not be underestimated. But it's also the case that working class people have, for the first time for a long, in British history, owned their own homes. That started with Margaret Thatcher. And with the general rise in house prices in London, that affected house prices across the whole of England, and working class people for the first time, as a result, owned what was, by their measure, a valuable asset. If that crashes, again, there will be political consequences.
Robert, who's driving this crazy train in the United States? Is it Biden? Is it Klaus? Is it Obama? Is it Hillary? Is it a combination of all of them? Who's driving this
It's
bus?
the kind of kids I went to Yale with. It's very much that group as a group. I mean, they were taught and cultured and trained really to run the world. That's how they saw it in many respects. It didn't change in the 90s compared to it being more overt in the 20s or 50s. Yeah. And I think they more than anyone. And Biden is more still a figurehead. Not as bad as Zelensky at just reading off a script, but not terribly far off. No. Kamala's way in over her head, doesn't understand any of this. No. And Blinken, does anybody look at Blinken and say there's a great future Secretary of State? He's still pretending Ukraine's going to win the war. I mean, 2 days ago I had a thing about this. He floated that idiotic thing where it's like, yeah, the Poles are going to give us, they're going to fly in some weapons and trigger a World War III for us. And the Poles were like, no, we'll send them to you instead. You decide what to do with it. But we're not getting bombed. You get bombed. And you make Germany get bombed. So I think we have idiots. The circus has come to town, and it's not a friendly circus. And I think that's the scariest thing. I used to say, I didn't trust Kissinger's moral compass, but I did trust his intellectual acumen. I don't trust either the moral compass or the intellectual acumen of the real decision makers. And these decision makers are your John Boltons of the world. They're just more on the neoliberal side than the neocon side. But it's the same. But for the neolibs, Ukraine matters even more. Because this is part of the EU project. This is part of the NATO project. This is much closer to the George Soros project. I mean, Soros has been obsessed with Ukraine now for decades. Heavily involved in the 2014 Maidan coup. Kind of sneered after it happened, said, well, Putin just thinks all these things are fake, and he just doesn't understand. This comes from the people, with that little smile. Of course, he couldn't help himself recently. He was like, I remember the great time when we were holding Budapest against the Soviets in 1944. It's like, who was it that was holding Budapest in 1944 against the Soviets there, George? Didn't they have certain symbols that are popular on some of those Ukrainian uniforms? That they just, the media keeps doing these photos and they keep finding people with the little Nazi symbols. And then, like poor NBC, or I think it was NBC, was trying, they're interviewing this local leader who has a picture of Bandera behind him. And they're like, oh, that's what that is. And they're trying to fade it out of the photos quickly live.
But they don't exist. They don't exist, Robert. According to PolitiFact, it's
exactly. I mean, even though basically every other year mainstream media has covered this. I mean, you can just do a basic search and find some mainstream outlet in the past 10 years that's covered there's a neo-Nazi problem in Ukraine. But of course, that's showing up because, and of course, as Alexander mentioned, the Russians, when they capture them, they just say, take off that shirt for you, will you? Because you get the tattoos, because they all love to tattoo themselves. It's like the Russian mob, they got to do a tattoo that tells you who they are. It's like Japan, like I have a tattoo engagement ring. It was a good idea at the time. It was Bora Bora. She's gone, but I kept it. But when I went to Tokyo, they said, be careful. They're going to think you're Yakuza, because only mobsters get those kind of tattoos here. So it's, because of that history that they can't help themselves in, they're going to continue to get exposed for what's going on. And that's what I think probably Americans' biggest worry is how much gets exposed as this progresses. And there's plenty of people in Ukraine that know where a lot of bodies are buried. And this doesn't even get into some of the other trafficking activities that have been going on in Ukraine. Ukraine's been on some top 10 lists over the past decade. None of them are good. And one of the top 10 lists is a certain kind of trafficking.
Yeah.
So that, is going to get into other issues. So it's just problem after problem after problem after problem. The biolabs are just kind of the worst tip of the spear for them. And I can't see how they politically dodge the ultimate consequences of a lot of this over time.
Yeah.
Is my short answer of what I think the end game is. Though I think, to me, the West took a big gamble, but also Putin took a big gamble.
Yeah, of course he did.
Because he's gambling that he can, in fact, beat this global economic empire and sustain Russia's economic, social, cultural, political independence to a degree that doesn't lead to the implosion of his country economically or politically.
Yeah.
And that's a massive, massive gamble. You may prove right. If anybody strategically, tactically has the mind to do so, it is likely him.
Yeah.
But again, the most popular leader by domestic polling for the last 20 years by any leader. There's nobody that's maintained the level of approval he has for that entire time period. In fact, most leaders have not even got close to his average.
No.
But can he survive this? Can he get through this? Can he? Because you saw they're doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down. They can't afford to lose to a certain degree. And because they didn't think of the possibility to lose, they're the more people likely to set off economic nuclear bombs than Putin is, who's more prepared. But it's one heck of a gamble. It is something to watch and witness for sure. But it is a little terrifying that we have elites that are this incompetent. Their moral compass being broken is manageable. Their intellectual inabilities and understanding of the world is not. That's what leads to more debacle than anything through history.
Robert, I completely agree. My friends, I'm going to have to go.
Let's wrap it up. Robert, where can people find you once again?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
All right. And to everybody that sent super chats, what we'll do, and to all the messages, Rumble, Odyssey, Locals, we'll wrap them all up. I'll gather them all together, and we will answer them on a video like we did during the last live stream. So don't worry, we're going to answer all of the questions, and we're going to put that up. Hopefully by the weekend. We'll try to see if we can get up on the weekend or Monday, the latest. So we'll get all those questions answered. The great Robert Barnes, thank you very, very much for an incredible live stream.
That was fun. It's as the Chinese proverbs say, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah, we certainly do that.
All right, Ed, Alexander, thank you very much. And to all our moderators, thank you very, very much. And to all the questions and comments and everybody, thank you for joining us this Friday evening. Take care.